news show. In this episode, we talk about the severe drought that Europe is experiencing and how it is affecting its energy supply. We also talk about the tomato flu that has been spreading in some states. But first, we talk about the Supreme Court. Yesterday was a busy day at the Apex Court. It gave orders related to important cases like that of the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, the Pegasus spyware case, and the Bilkis Bano case. But this is not it. Turns out the court is expected to get busier. And this is because starting next week, a 5-judge constitution bench will begin hearing 25 key cases that have been pending so far. And this will begin 2 days after Chief Justice of India N.V. Ramana retires and Justice U.U. Lalit takes his place. In this segment, Indian Express's Apurva Vishwanath, who writes on law for the paper, joins us to talk about it. So, Apurva, could you begin by talking about these 25 cases that this 5-judge bench is planning to hear?
So these are 25 cases that are required to be heard by a 5-judge bench. A 5-judge bench is usually referred to as a constitution bench. And for any cases involving the interpretation of constitution or to settle the differences between two smaller bench judgments, a 5-judge bench is constituted. So as of 1st of August, the Supreme Court's own records show that there are about 342 5-judge bench cases pending before it, some 15 7-judge cases, and some 135 9-judge cases pending before the court. So this is fast forwarding 25 of these 5-judge bench cases. These are cases that deal with religious issues. These are cases that deal with some political questions about reservations. Crucially, there are some challenges which question the centre's use of arbitrary power, that is, say, the cases like demonetization. All of these cases now lawyers have been told to prepare, and so that from Monday onwards, that is next week onwards, they can be heard by constitution benches.
And the Supreme Court has faced criticism for not hearing many of these key cases. Has it ever given a response as to why it has not done so?
So there has been a lot of disquiet around the fact that some crucial cases are not being listed and heard by the court. Say, for example, cases challenging the electoral bond scheme or the challenge to the dilution of Article 370 and the special status of Jammu and Kashmir. These are all cases that have just simply not been taken up by court. But, one of the reasons we keep hearing from the court is the pandemic, and the courts have moved to functioning virtually. Initially, there was this conversation about virtual courts not being conducive to hear constitutional cases which require, lengthy arguments stretched over days. The judges said attention spans of lawyers and judges could take a hit if it happens virtually. But some cases were heard virtually. But it's almost 2.5 years now since the virtual court system has sort of been put in place. For large parts, it's here to stay. So the court had to devise some way around this. Now that the court has started functioning physically in its premises 3 days a week and 2 days are virtual hearings. So the court can now hear these larger bench matters. But otherwise, judges who've retired or even former Chief Justice, somebody like Justice Ranjan Gogoi when he retired, when they were asked why certain cases were not listed, the answers were that there is a listing mechanism in the Supreme Court. The registry guides this process, and some cases have just not been prioritized or picked up over others. But there has been no coherent response as to why some cases have just not been heard by the court.
And Apurva, the other key point here is that this 5-judge bench will begin hearing these cases 2 days after the current Chief Justice N.V. Ramana retires and Justice U.U. Lalit takes his place. What stands out to you regarding the timing of this?
That's right. Justice Ramana retires on 26th August, and the next day, Justice U.U. Lalit takes over as the new Chief Justice of India. And this is signaling, of course, from the new Chief Justice of India that there is an important institutional reform that is being made, that constitution bench cases will be prioritized, will be heard. And this is something that Justice Lalit had even told us in the interview that we did with him, where he said he acknowledged that there is an issue with cases just not being listed. And he said that we must create avenues in the court where crucial cases are heard, and sort of decided quickly so that you firewall yourself from any criticism from the outside. So one of the key reforms that he suggested was having maybe a constitution bench that sits through the year. And Justice Lalit spoke extensively about when the Supreme Court has 34 judges, why can't it spare 5 judges throughout the year for hearing important constitutional cases? So this was one of the things that Justice Lalit spoke about. And just days before he takes over, the fact that a direction goes out to lawyers to prepare for these important cases, that's a very important signal.
Okay, in the beginning, we mentioned that yesterday was a busy day at the Supreme Court. We heard some important orders and statements come out of the court, including one related to the Pegasus case. Now, just for the benefit of our listeners, Pegasus is a very powerful military-grade spyware that was used to target over 300 mobile phone numbers in India, including that of several journalists, business persons, 2 serving ministers in the Modi government, 3 opposition leaders, and 1 constitutional authority. And a Supreme Court appointed technical committee had been put in charge to examine 29 phones that had apparently been hacked. What has the committee now said about these phones?
So yesterday's hearing was where the Supreme Court looked into the reports that were submitted by the technical committee, and also Justice Ravindran, who was a former Supreme Court judge who headed this committee. So the technical committee, the court said, has examined 29 phones, out of which they found some sort of malware in 5 phones. But despite extensive efforts, the technical committee said that they've not been able to establish conclusively that this was the Pegasus malware. So to that end, the inquiry is at a dead end. There's no concrete determination that the technical committee has been able to make. On the other report, which is a report submitted by Justice Ravindran, where Justice Ravindran sort of identifies the loopholes or the legal lacunae which sort of expose citizens to these vulnerabilities and has made certain recommendations on how you can strengthen the legal regime around cybersecurity and ensure that privacy is protected.
Okay, so these are the 2 reports that the court looked at. But the other thing of importance is that there have been allegations that the government had in fact used Pegasus because the Israeli firm NSO, which has developed this spyware, has repeatedly said that it only sells Pegasus to federal governments. So has the committee shed any light regarding these allegations?
In fact, this Chief Justice, while he was talking about these 2 reports, noted that the government has refused to participate in the probe before the technical committee as well, just like it did before the Supreme Court. Citing national security, the government has refused to take a stand and just answer this question on whether it bought the Pegasus spyware from NSO and used it on Indian citizens. So this question remains unanswered. Perhaps in the next few hearings, we'll see if the Supreme Court pushes the government to take a stand, or if the government refuses to take a stand, what is the extent of judicial review that is possible here? Can you hold the government to contempt? Or is there any other way to resolve this constitutional question? That's something we'll have to see in the next hearings.
Now, besides Pegasus, the other order that came out of the Supreme Court was regarding the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, or PMLA. Now, we know that this act gives the Enforcement Directorate wide powers to arrest an individual, search, seize and attach properties, and makes it very difficult for someone to get bail. And recently, the Supreme Court had upheld the constitutional validity of this act. And this had raised some serious concerns among experts and civil society groups. So could you talk about what the court has said about its order now?
So in July, the Supreme Court had upheld all the key provisions of the PMLA. It's sort of a rare occasion where the Supreme Court has agreed to review this judgment. Justice Khanvilkar, who headed the bench that delivered the verdict in July, has since retired. And Chief Justice Ramana was presiding over a bench, while the other 2 judges remained the same, Justices Dinesh Maheshwari and C.T. Ravi Kumar. So this bench has said that on a prima facie view, there are 2 issues which would require reconsideration. And one issue has, of course, been part of the stringent bail provision that we've talked about earlier, that the PMLA imposes reversal of the presumption of innocence of the accused in the case. So while granting bail, the accused has a burden of proof to show that he is not guilty, which is contrary to our established principles in criminal law, wherein accused is innocent until proven guilty. And the other condition is that the accused also has to show to the judge that he is unlikely to commit this offense or will not commit this offense again if granted bail. This is one aspect where where the Supreme Court said that the judgment might have gotten it wrong and we'll need to re-examine this issue. The other issue that Chief Justice Ramana pointed out was the sharing of the ECIR, the Enforcement Case Information Report, which is a document which tells an accused why he's arrested, what is the scheduled offense for which he has been accused of money laundering. That ECIR, the Supreme Court's verdict in July, had said that the Enforcement Directorate is not mandated to share that with an accused. So these are the two issues where the Supreme Court said we could take a relook. However, the court has limited itself to these two issues. So we'll really have to see how the lawyers sneak in the other grounds on which they're seeking a review.
And Apurva, how unusual is it for the Supreme Court to review a judgment that is this recent?
So judgment of the Supreme Court is final and binding, except that there is a provision in the Constitution which allows a review. And this review is allowed only in very narrow, exceptional circumstances. And the ground really, if you just distill it, is just one thing, that there must be a grave error apparent on the face of record. There must have been a mistake that the court has committed. And it's not, a detailed reading, but it should be so obvious that it's right there. So maybe citing a case law that has been overruled, or relying on a wrong point of law, or relying on a incorrect factual matrix. These are circumstances where the court goes into a review. Review itself is a very rare happening in the Supreme Court, and to have an open hearing of the review and then decide it so quickly, even before the ink on the earlier judgment has sort of dried, that is very unusual. But my understanding is it comes so quickly because the Chief Justice is set to retire, and this is one of the cases he decided to take up at the time of his retirement.
Okay, and finally, the other order we heard from the Supreme Court was regarding the Bilkis Bano case. We know that earlier this week, the Gujarat government had released 11 people who had been convicted in the Bilkis Bano murder and gang rape case of 2002 under its remission and premature release policy. And this decision was challenged in the Supreme Court. Could you talk about what the court has now decided to do with this petition?
So in yesterday's hearing, what the Supreme Court did was say that it will hear the challenge against the premature release of these 11 convicts, and it issued notice to the state of Gujarat and also said that the 11 convicts be made a party to the case because they have a stake in the hearing as well. So this is sort of the preliminary steps before actually hearing the case on merits. In this case, what is significant is that in May, the Supreme Court itself had allowed one of the convicts in this case, Radhesham Shah, to approach the Gujarat government and seek remission. The court had directed the Gujarat government to consider the case on merits and grant remission if applicable. Now the court will have to look into whether the Gujarat government followed due process in granting remission to these 11 convicts and whether their premature release is okay considering the gravity of the offence. They were, after all, convicted for the repeated gang rape of Bilkis Bano, who was pregnant at that time, and also for multiple murders, including the murder of a 3-year-old child. So these are all questions that the court will have to answer in the next hearings.
And next we talk about Europe. Right now, Europe is facing a severe drought, one that is being described as the worst in 500 years. For some time now, the Western media has been showing dramatic images of riverbeds that have dried up and sunken ships that have emerged after the water levels have gone down. In fact, during previous droughts, people had engraved stones near the water lines as a warning to future generations. And these ominous-looking stones have now emerged out of the water as well. Earlier this month, on August 10, the Global Drought Observatory had said that about 64% of the continent's landmass was experiencing drought conditions. And during that time, the situation was only worsening. In this segment, Indian Express's Amitabh Sinha, who writes on science and environment for the paper, joins us to talk about how the drought is affecting countries in the region.
So Europe is going through a drought. This drought hasn't begun yesterday. It has been there for some time. Most of the places in Europe have been in drought-like conditions for at least 2 months now. July was exceptionally dry. There was very little rainfall. In some countries like Netherlands, they have had the driest July ever, actually. And in other parts also, Germany, France, the rainfall has been far below normal. So there have been very dry conditions prevailing for at least 2 months. It's just getting worse. And right now, probably Europe is at the peak of its drought, what is being described as the worst in 500 years. Now, just a little bit on that description of worst in 500 years. The data is not conclusive as yet whether it's the worst drought in 500 years or not, mainly because the drought is still ongoing. So that is still to be established. But there have been scientists who have said that this is probably worse than 2018, which was another major drought year for Europe. And that 2018 year was also described by many as probably the worst in 500 years. So the 500 years reference point that we are repeatedly pointing to is a drought in Europe in 1540. And that was a year-long drought, and apparently tens of thousands of people perished in that drought. So that was supposed to be a historic event in Europe, and the comparisons are being made with that drought.
And Amitabh, because of this drought, Europe's waterways have been affected, mainly because the water is so low that a lot of large ships, for example, can't move through them. Could you talk about how that has impacted Europe's energy supply?
Yes. So Europe has a very robust network of waterways, especially Central Europe. If you see all the rivers, the large rivers, they are all navigable and navigable for very large ships, and a large amount of cargo especially is carried on these ships, both upstream and downstream. So Europe depends majorly on this river transport, which turns out to be far more economical than, rail or air transport. So that's why a lot of goods are shifted on river transport. One of the things you will see, it's a very common sight, especially in Germany, Central Europe, in the Rhine belt, you would see very large ships carrying large amount of coal. And a lot of this coal is actually, heading towards thermal power plants which produce electricity. So what has happened is, because the rivers are not carrying enough water for these ships to navigate, therefore there has been a disruption in the supply of goods, including supply of coal, which has led to, some sort of shortage in lots of power plants, which has resulted in below normal power generation. So there is some amount of electricity shortage in some of these countries. Also, less of electricity generation means there has been a rise in energy prices. And particularly in the UK, you would have seen big headlines about household energy prices shooting through the roof. It has already almost doubled from the normal levels, and it's going to go up further.
Yeah, and another way the power crisis has worsened is because nuclear power plants are now struggling. And this is due to the fact that large amounts of water is needed to cool their reactors, and right now there is a lot of water shortage. Plus, you write that agricultural production is also expected to be affected, and water is being rationed in many places. And Amitabh, when we hear about such extreme events, climate change is what comes to mind. But these are the kind of things that climate experts have been warning us about, right? That they will become more frequent in the future.
So we've been hearing it for a long time, and scientists have been warning us about these kind of events for a fair amount of time now, almost to the point of being repetitive. It just seems that there is nothing new to say, because it's the same thing again and again, that extreme weather events, whether it's rainfall related or whether it's drought, whether it's wildfires, extreme weather events would, both the intensity and the frequency of these events is going to increase. And this is being said for several years now. What we are seeing now is all of this unfolding right in front of our eyes, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. If you notice, these events have become much more frequent, much more intense, for even general people like us to be able to notice that something unusual is happening. And this is the kind of things that climate change is producing, which scientists have been warning us about for quite some time. And if you look at the pictures coming from Europe in the last 1 or 2 months, the situation really looks very, very grim.
And Amitabh, although we are talking about Europe, there are other places that are also experiencing a severe drought, right? Like China, for example.
Yeah, so apparently China is facing the worst drought in about 60 years. The largest river in China, that's the Yangtze River, and it's huge. It's more than 6,000 kilometers long and lifeline to a very large part of the population. So Yangtze Rivers, the water levels in many stretches of this river is at an all-time low since they started keeping records some 50, 60 years ago, or maybe 70 years ago. So two of the largest lakes in China, their water levels are at historic lows. And China's drought is just beginning to take shape. I mean, it's been happening for the last few weeks that we have been hearing about China's drought. Europe has been in this situation for much longer, for almost like 2 months now. And there has been some amount of drought unfolding in the United States as well. Almost 40% of the country is in different varying degrees of drought condition as of now.
And in the end, we talk about a flu. Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Haryana, and Odisha have all reported cases of a flu that has largely been affecting children. This is the tomato flu. And recently, the Union Health Ministry issued a set of guidelines on the prevention, testing, and treatment of the infection. In this segment, Indian Express's Anonna Dutt tells us more about it. So, Anonna, something called the tomato flu has been reported in at least 4 states now. Could you talk about what exactly is it?
Tomato flu is actually not the right name for it. Now the researchers have realized that this is something which is called as hand, foot and mouth disease. Not the same as the foot and mouth disease in animals. This causes basically red tomato-like rashes, which is why the name. And the thing is, this has been reported in Kerala for some years, intermittently it gets reported in children. And people earlier used to think that it could probably be an after effect of dengue and chikungunya, which is quite common over there. So they used to think this was an after effect, but now the researchers say it is a different clinical presentation of hand, foot and mouth disease.
Right, and besides these red rashes that you talked about, other symptoms of this disease include diarrhea, dehydration, nausea, vomiting, and fatigue. But could this disease also lead to any serious complications?
So this is like any other flu, happens mainly in children. Their immune system is not as strong as the adults. So it happens in children and in very few adults who probably have a bad immune system. So no, it is not a very severe disease. It results in these flu-like symptoms and the rashes, and it actually heals on its own. It's a self-limiting disease. But yes, in a very small proportion of cases, it can result in central nervous system effects and encephalitis, which is the inflammation of the brain.
And Anonna, do we know why it is spreading now, or at least why we are hearing about it so much now?
It's not a new virus. It's a group of enteroviruses which cause this disease, and it happens across India from time to time. A few cases get reported everywhere. Why we are hearing now could be 2 reasons, the researchers think. One is, of course, that there might be actual increase in the number of cases now. And with schools reopening after the pandemic, there is more mixing among the children, and that's why it's spreading more after 2 years of not spreading. So that is one reason. The second reason that researchers feel is that now, after the pandemic, testing has become very accessible and also something that people do. I mean, earlier for a viral infection, people would usually not get tested to check, which viral infection is it. It's viral infection, it gets better on its own. But now more and more people are testing, and more labs have the capability to do these tests. So yeah, the numbers are more. So it could be an actual increase or an increase because of the testing.
Right, and what do experts say about the things that individuals can do to protect themselves from this hand, foot and mouth disease?
So this disease actually spreads from either like the saliva droplets or the liquid in the lesions. So again, these are things that you would do for any of the contagious diseases that don't use the same utensils. Keep the person in isolation, wash their linens and clothes separately, wash it properly. And other than that, the government guidelines that have come in focuses on children because this is happening mainly in children. So they have said that tell the children about the infection, tell them not to hug a person who clearly has fever and rashes, things like that. So general precautionary measures that you would take for any other viral infection is what you have to do for this as well. There is nothing else.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.